Hi, Mr. Bond here with another botany lesson, this time focusing on stems. So let's jump into what are the functions of stems. And one of the most important ones is that stems really, they hold up the leaves and other structures so that they're capable of getting light. Plants, like animals, are competitive. And you're to outcompete another plant, well, one of the ways to do that is to just get more sunlight than them. How do you do that? Well, be taller than them. So stems function in making a plant taller so that they can hold up their leaves and other structures like flowers as well, so that they can get more sunlight. Flowers don't need the sunlight, but being held up off the ground makes them more accessible to pollinators like bees. Another function of stems is to have the vascular tissue running through them, so xylem and phloem to transport food and water from the roots up into the leaves or backwards from the leaves down into the roots to store nutrients like sugar and things like that. Another function is to produce new structures like new leaves, new stems, and new flowers from structures that are called buds. More on those in a minute. There's two major types of stems that we see. They're herbaceous, the one on the left here, and those are soft stems. And then there's woody stems, like those that make up that of a trunk of a tree or the trunk of or the stem of a shrub. But the soft stems, the herbaceous ones, are the ones you think of when you think of the most flowering plants, right? Like over here, this is a thistle. Or if you were to think of a rose, for example, or a tulip, or those types of plants. Over here on the right then, of course, the woody stem. This is anything that produces wood in its stem. Let's take a look at the external anatomy of a stem. We'll start here with the bud. I mentioned the structure earlier, and it's really the bud to highlight is this set of tissue right in here. And a bud is undeveloped tissue that can become something new, and most often it's going to become a leaf or a new stem, but of course it can also turn into a flower as well. In many types of woody plants, these buds will be covered by scales, and in fact you can identify a woody plant in the winter that's lost its leaves by the types of buds that it has and specifically the scales that cover it, because the leaves will be gone at that point. A node is an attachment point off of a stem, and in this case it's an attachment point for a leaf, but it can also be an attachment point for a stem. The location of nodes is also another identifying feature for many plants. In this image here, what you see is you see a node that comes off to the right side here, and then off to the left side here, and then off to the right side here. It alternates its pattern. In fact, that's a type of pattern that's called alternate. Opposite would be if there were two nodes that are right across from each other, like one here and one here. We'll talk about those in a bit more detail later. But nodes are just attachment points. And then finally an internode. Inter means between. Node is the attachment point. So an internode is just the space in between nodes. So all of this space right here in the stem, that's the internode. Those are the major external anatomy portions of the stem. Let's take a look inside. In this case, we have a dicot stem. I can tell it's a dicot stem specifically by the pattern of the vascular tissue. More on that in a minute. Let's start on the outside and work our way in. The epidermis is that single layer of cells found on the outside of the stem. It's a protective layer. The phloem then is the tissue, the vascular tissue that's responsible for moving the sugary substances that are made in photosynthesis. They're always found on the exterior of the vascular bundles. They're these, typically they pick up a stain in color that's like purplish red, and the holes, the openings of them, these are the sieve 2 members, are smaller than the vessels that you find in the xylem. Which brings us, of course, next to the xylem, which is always located interior in the vascular bundle and has larger openings. And the xylem's job is to move water. Remember that xylem is a one-way flow from the roots up through the stems and then into the leaves, but phloem can move in either direction. Phloem can move up from the roots or down from the leaves, just depending on what the plant needs. Here's indicating a whole vascular bundle in this image here. You can see the phloem on the outside, the xylem on the inside, and then this layer of cells right in between it, right here, this is the vascular cambium. The vascular cambium's job is to create the xylem and the phloem. Remember, vascular cambium is one type of lateral meristematic tissue, a type of tissue that's actively dividing inside of plants all the time. The pith, then, this is the center of the stem in this case, and this pith is generally primarily composed of parenchyma cells. And then finally the cortex. The cortex is going to be the cell layer that's on the outside of the vascular bundles, but yet inside of the epidermis. Again, mostly made of parenchyma cells, but sometimes you'll find some collenchyma cells and even some sclerenchyma cells in this area, depending upon the plant's needs and structure. Let's take a look at a monocot stem. And the first thing that you'll notice, actually, let's go back for just a moment because I forgot to mention it. Notice the pattern in the dicot stem here in terms of the vascular tissue. Notice how it forms a ring around the outside. That's the defining feature of a dicot stem. All of the vascular bundles are arranged in a ring around the outside of the stem. Now compare that to this monocot stem, and you can see the vascular bundles are just scattered all over the place. There's no real organization when we take a look at the vascular bundles. And so the epidermis, again, is that single layer of outside cells. Vascular bundle, I've highlighted one of them. Now, if you look closely, it's hard to see without zooming in on this. You can see how there's a couple openings that are larger. Those are the xylem, and the smaller ones in between would be the phloem. So identifying xylem and phloem in a monocot, xylem are the large openings, phloem are the smaller. There's no indication of inside or outside like what we saw in the dicot stem. Then finally, the ground tissue is all of the filling space. Notice how there is not a pith, nor is there a cortex, because there's no definitive vascular tissue area like what we saw in the dicot stem that formed that ring. Because the vascular tissue is all over the place, we just call all of the filling space in a monocot stem the ground tissue. Let's talk about growth within stems. First, primary growth occurs at terminal buds. Terminal bud we can see right here. This is the bud that's found right at the end of the stem. This is an apical meristem, and the job here is to make this stem longer. You can see on the outside here, here's another bud, here's another bud, and here's another. These are what we call axial buds because they're on the sides or the lateral components of this stem. So these would develop into probably new leaves or maybe even new stems. Secondary growth makes the plant wider, and really there's two types of tissues that create secondary growth. The first is shown here in this woody stem. We'll talk about woody stems more next lesson, but the vascular cambium's job is to create the xylem and phloem. The vascular cambium is this red layer right here, and it's sandwiched in between the xylem, in this case which is wood, and the phloem, which is this orange color. So this vascular cambium's job is to create the xylem, which moves water, and to create the phloem, which moves food. And it's sandwiched right in between it. It does this by making rings specifically of wood, and that's where the rings come from when we take a look at the interior of a woody stem. And it just makes the phloem larger as the stem continues to get wider. The second type of lateral meristematic tissue is cork cambium. And you can see it right here. It's on this inner layer of the bark right here. This is the cork cambium. And its job is to create the cork, which is just the bark. And that's the type of secondary growth that we see for stems. That's all we'll talk about now for stems. We'll look at woody stems in a bit more detail in our next lesson.